Hello.
Hi,
Thanks for being here today.
thank you for having me.
It's been a little bit since I've had a guest at the supper table, and I was thinking it's appropriate that you are my next guest because I was just joking recently that you're kind of like a dinner daddy who's always offering to pick up the check, which I'm very into. And when I told you that, you said something about it coming from an experience in your past where somebody fed you when you were having a hard time feeding yourself. Um, and I feel like that's the perfect anecdote, like the perfect segue into this series that you're writing, Healing Abundance, because it reveals the kind of scarcity we often need to experience before we build capacity for true generosity, before we understand what abundance even means. And that's very much at the heart and center of this series. Um, yeah, but before we get into all of that, I'll just introduce you a bit more formally. This is Jacob Joseph, a new friend in my real life community, and also a writer and researcher. What would you say is the focus of your work?
I made up a word for the focus of my work because it's cross-domain. But I study the intersection of ecology, economy, and culture. So I call it ecoculture. But that's a made-up word. So
Great, I love making up words. um, yeah, so introduce this series, Healing Abundance. We're talking about the first installment today titled We Were Fed. What inspired this series? Why did this become a hyperfixation for you?
I had several inspirations for this. Like it wasn't just one single thing. It was kind of a culmination of a lot of things. I spent a lot of time in nature, in my garden, spent a lot of time in cities, and I find myself more comfortable, more at home in natural settings and things like that. And so that was one piece of it, is kind of studying myself and like why did I feel different in a different environment? Like I have a lot of friends and family in cities and I'm really happy and enjoy spending time with them. So why did I feel more at home, you know, out on a hike or in the garden or that kind of thing. And another piece was the current ecological and economic environments are fairly overloaded with toxins, in my view, and I've been studying those as well, mostly from like derivative of some works and research of bell hooks. She described um, something that I consider like naming the demon. Like she described, I can't remember the order that she put it in, but like white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, empirical colonialism. And I was like, aha, that's the problem. Like that when I read that, I was like, that resonated so hard as like hitting several different pieces. And in reading her work and other works around abundance and scarcity, I saw this pattern of scarcity being something that's produced. And that sort of made me think, okay, if we can make scarcity, can we do something about it? And then I think in the US, we have a tendency to be very violent and use the language of violence. Like fighting scarcity is kind of the natural
Mhm.
US frame. And I also my frame of reference is also that that's a little bit fire with fire, and you just get more fire. And I'm trying to do something different or approach it differently, which is something I also kind of picked up from Audre Lorde. The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. So thinking about it in that frame of if the master's tools are violence, then violence may not be the answer. And just historically speaking, violence tends to lead to more violence. Even now, when we talk about like healthcare, we talk about fighting cancer, not healing cancer, and things like that. And so that I just trying to take that healing frame and healing approach towards abundance and really dig into the what's the mechanism of it? What's the science behind it? What's the theology behind it? What's the psychology behind it? And kind of approach it from a lot of different angles.
Right. So it's like a generative framing. Rather than fighting scarcity, you're asking what it would take to return to the abundance that is already readily or has historically been readily available to us. I really love that we're already knee deep into the home metaphor because, of course, this is at the crux of my work. And although a lot of what I do is focused around, just sort of more everyday life at home, this is what it leads us to. This is what it leads us to emotionally and spiritually. And I think that's pervasive across different areas of study and interest because yeah, it's like you said, you began this project because you found where you felt at home. And and that's what most of us are seeking ultimately. Um, when you introduced yourself to me earlier, when we first met, you had called yourself a calm prepper and a gentle leftist, which I really loved because I feel like the preppers really need to do it, but do it calmly, and the leftists need to do it, but do it gently, and also need to be a lot gentler with themselves a lot of the time. Um, yeah, so I appreciate this approach because it's important in a way to tear things down and to fight back, depending. But in my experience, we always hit a wall with that approach. And exhaust ourselves, deplete ourselves, and can never like return to the sense of being safe enough to like support ourselves and support one another. You begin this series with the question, what would you give to return to Eden? What would you give to never work a day in your life and have all the food, medicine, building materials, and free time literally in the world available to you when you needed them? Would you trade it for an apple? What about an iPhone? It's such a powerful opening, especially because you then get into this like man and his symbols thing where, you're revealing that it's no accident that the iPhone's symbology is in Apple and that we associate this with the Garden of Eden. Um, but before we get into that, tell me, what is the trade that we made when we actively chose scarcity over abundance? And how and why did we make that trade? Where we gave the apple of Eden over for the Apple iPhone.
So I think the trade, I mean, this is what I'm really exploring in the series as I continue it, but I think the trade that was made was something along the lines of cultivated agriculture in lieu of natural abundance, meaning like indigenous plants and ecosystems and things like that. So if you discover a new fruit in a foreign land and it's delicious and you're like, I want to grow this, you might take some seeds home, clear what's there, and plant it. And maybe you weren't aware of USDA zones, and you planted something that's maybe very invasive or aggressive in that particular environment, or depletes the nutrients, like not having crop rotations and things like that. So my kind of working theory is that there was a ecological and archaeological or anthropological sort of memory of the transition to agriculture, encoded in like biblical scriptural Hebrew text and things like that. And so that's sort of the premise that I'm working from is that something along those lines happened in history, and the archaeology supports that. Like the literal fossil record aligns with the textual fossil record. And then what
Mhm.
was the second half of that question?
Um, how and why did we make this trade where we gave the apple of Eden over for the Apple iPhone?
So I think one piece of that, how did we make the trade? I think this is kind of part of my part of one of the points of the article I try to highlight is I don't think it was this great horrible sin that we, defied God or something like that, so much as we acted without thinking. Like we used our power without fully understanding the consequences.
Yeah,
Which is a simple thing to do that I do every day. Like that's not
sure.
not trying to beat anybody up about that. It happens. Um, and then why I think it happened is I do think there's a part of human nature that gets excited about new things. And so that's where I found empathy with that Adam and Eve narrative is really around like, yeah, if somebody gives me a new piece of fruit and it's delicious, I'm gonna be like, yo, let's do this. Let's get more of it, you know? So I'm like, just in and maybe I wouldn't, now in my framing relative to my study of ecology and ecosystems, I'd be very cautious about planting something. But 10 years ago, I would gladly plant the most invasive seed in the world because it had delicious fruit, like before I knew. So like I get that and I get that like even if you kind of take it very literal as a piece of fruit and not a metaphor and all that, it's like, yeah, that resonates with me.
Right, it's almost like guerrilla gardening on a
Yeah.
cultural level.
Yeah.
Like I'm just gonna throw these random ass seeds that I found and see what comes up. There is a kind of almost innocence to it, right? Which also overlays perfectly with this mythology of the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve begin in like innocent and naive state and so on and so forth. Um, yeah, so in the thesis of this series, you say this series is a long form of a single argument approached from four directions: the mathematical, the theological, the ecological, and the neurobiological. And you're kind of like making a case for abundance or like return to abundance through each of these channels of information. Um, and you're not a cynic, and typically when people approach this particular part of what is happening in the world and what needs to happen in the world, there is a lot of cynicism or despair, but you always kind of circle us back to the good news. And in this piece, you say the good news in aggregate, the damage is enormous. For each of us individually, the sins are small, so the healings are also small. The gate was never locked. What are these small sins and what are these small healings?
So I think it kind of ties back to if you're doing something without thinking, if you're sort of acting in an automated fashion, um, potentially to your own detriment or to others' detriment, um, or maybe to your benefit and somebody else's detriment, or vice versa, like, but we do so many things, or I find myself at least doing so many things every day that where I'm sort of on autopilot. Like when I go to the grocery store, the piece of or the type of bread I pick out, I don't really think about it every time I go. I just grab the thing I got last time that I liked. So
Mm-hmm.
something simple like that, or even the I mean, getting into sort of capitalism and the way capitalism accelerates growth, um, I think there's a risk with capitalism of over accelerating growth, meaning like you can move too fast, you can grow something too quickly, and it's can be like kind of an unhealthier growth and a little riskier. And so, in a similar way, like doing anything too fast or trying to rush something, um, I think has a natural consequence. And so, I think that that's part of what I think is essential to the healing is just starting to notice that. So not even trying to change your behavior, but just being aware of the little micro decisions you make every day, paper or plastic. Like the every day we throw things in a trash can in the US, right? But what we don't think about is what happens after we do that. And what happens after we do that is, maybe we put it outside once a week, then somebody comes to collect it, that goes somewhere, that usually gets processed, then that goes and will usually sit somewhere or get incinerated. And, each day when we buy things, they are unavoidably wrapped in plastic. And so part of our purchase price, like part of what we're paying for is trash. And we're paying for it on both ends because we're paying for it on the front end. When we purchase the thing, it's built into the cost of what we're buying. And we pay for it on the back end because we think of trash as free, but it's a service paid for by taxes. And so our tax money is paying for the trash that we also paid to acquire. And so, like, kind of thinking through that whole life cycle of a product, for instance, and I'm just giving that one example, but like, there's plenty of them that I'm going to talk about in the series. But um, just think about that one example of like you purchase trash and then you pay to get rid of it. And that's
Right.
like a double loss, and then you don't have the thing because you got rid of it. And so thinking about like, maybe if you purchased something that was compostable, then sure, you pay a little more for it, but you compost it either collectively or in your own garden, and then now you've got more nutrients in your garden. So that's like net positive versus the plastic cycle example is like net negative. Like you lose, lose, lose versus like you maybe lose a little money in the purchase, but then you gain, gain, gain.
It's so interesting because when I work with clients in reclaiming their home from clutter and mess, which is largely a result of keeping house in a consumer culture, I often have to give people permission to just throw things away. Um, People have really internalized all responsibility for these like life damaging systems at large. And they will take on that burden and responsibility at the expense of their own basic functionality and health and well being. And so we do a lot of like feeling our feelings about the landfills, and we do a lot of like moments of micro grieving for the landfills as we throw things away. Like people actually believe that just like letting their homes be full of trash somehow saves the earth, right? And I know that there is going to be some like dissonance when those of us who care deeply about the earth and who are not like dissociated from our interdependence with it um, have to take a more anti-perfectionistic stance for the sake of our own like short-term survival or well-being. um, I'm always kind of going after lifestyle achievements and how we are told that lifestyle achievements are the epitome of personal growth and illustrative of strength of character, and how that perspective doesn't take into account the way that we are crippled by forms of systemic oppression. That might, in my case, it makes it impossible to recycle. I haven't recycled for 2.5 years because there is no recycling center here at my apartment complex. It's a very difficult thing. There's no space to store the recycling. I literally don't have the executive functioning available to me to add on one more task right now. And it hasn't been like this my whole life. I've recycled for most of my life. So this is something I tell my clients too. Like, hey, you don't have to do this perfectly forever. You can just do it when it's actually possible for you to, because the reality is it's not like there's an upcycling center. It's not like there's a repair shop. It's not like it's easy to do these things. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about how we can negotiate these small healings with the fact that we cannot, as individuals, rightfully take on all the responsibility for systemic shortcomings?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time with that one because I am a recovering hoarder and collector of broken things that have so much potential that I can see. Um, so yeah, I think part of it is the plastic problem is not us as individuals, ours as individuals to own. Um, we don't make the decision of what to wrap the products in that we buy, and many of those products we need, they're necessary. You know, food is often wrapped in plastic, and that's like a safety measure. Um, sure, there's alternatives, but like that's what we got, and we need to eat. You know, like I'm very practical in that lens, and um, to me that as a person who has collected a lot of trash with the intention of, you know, landfill diversion, um, and then also had difficulty letting go of that, part of what helped me to let go of it is sort of framing that the trash that I collected as um, a sunk cost or something that was already done. Like the little sin in that case was maybe on the part of the manufacturer who wrapped it in plastic. And I mean, you could trace it back the whole supply chain, or I'm not trying to like place blames necessarily, but like who has control over if it's wrapped in plastic? That's not me as an individual. And if I need things, then, you know, to survive, to live, to thrive, that's not my responsibility because it's not in my power to change as an individual. So then I think it's more about like what is in my power to change. And it might be like, hey, I will recycle because it is something that's easy for me. Like I didn't grow up doing it, but I'm going to try doing it. Or it may be that no, I'm going to keep my house clean and free of trash and try to prevent more of it from coming in, you know, where I can. And so to me, it's like there's these little pieces of things you can do that you don't have to solve the whole world's problem. You don't have to like divert all the trash from the landfill. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the the problems are easy to deal with if they are aggregate, meaning like if we all have our own separate mini landfills in our own houses, then we can't really see the size of the problem and we can't really address it. Like one project I would love to do in the future is go through a landfill and photograph every single manufacturer label that I see, because that tells you who made the trash and who profited from the trash. And that to me is where there's, you know, like and doing that when you throw things away, like what am I throwing away? Like who made this? And thinking about that and that's sort of the looking back, that looking a little more deeper than you normally would, um, than rather than just like doing the action automatically. And that's kind of what I mean is like going back to the Adam and Eve thing. I think, you know, shiny new fruit that's juicy and sweet, you don't think about it, you just grab it and you eat it. And this is kind of like similar framing of like, hey, when you throw something out, you can think about it a little bit. You can let go of it. You can thank it if it brought you something, you know, some joy, or brought, you know, was wrapped something of joy for you. You know, that kind of thing. And just um not so much that I'm glad you mentioned that because the plastic example does sort of like hit on this narrative of recycling that's been kind of hammered into us, and I don't think that narrative is useful. And it's
Yeah, and
more
there's
about
also this big question now about like, does recycling even do anything? Because for a while, information was floating around about these trash barges and, you know, things ending up in the ocean and how recycling doesn't actually, like, a lot of recycling doesn't actually get recycled. Similarly, you know, 70% of items that go to a thrift store end up in the trash. So, yeah, have you fact checked some of that? What's the deal there?
yeah. So aluminum and glass are eminently more recyclable, and tin as well, than plastics. Plastics have a multitude of recycling problems, and also aluminum, tin, and glass are more reusable, whereas plastic tends to be less reusable because it degrades a bit over time structurally and things like that. But a large portion of plastic recycling ends up in either landfills or gets incinerated. And part of that is it's a cleaning issue, like it's hard to clean, it's very expensive to clean. Part of it's a sorting issue. If we only had one type of plastic, the PETE, or think the other one's called HEP or something like that. But if we only had like one type of plastic, then that was all we used, it would be much easier to recycle. But there's a very expensive sorting problem that happens that usually a person, they've automated some of it, but usually a person has to be involved in to some degree of separating which is this type of plastic versus this type of plastic that just exacerbates the problem. And so um, that's a big piece of it is just that there are many, many friction points with plastic recycling that are not present with other materials. And absolutely some of the plastic gets recycled and part of actually how you can help the problem of improving the recycling like throughput is putting less in the recycling. So like the usually it's the black plastics that sometimes the food containers that are black plastic. There's others that have a little triangle at the bottom with a five. Those are almost entirely non-recyclable. And so if those end up
Wow.
in the recycling, that means somebody or a machine, somebody has to pay or put effort into taking that out and putting it in the trash. So by you not putting it in the trash, when you do it, it's it's that kind of stuff. Um, but there's also it kind of underscores the point of like I don't think there's any reason to beat yourself up or feel bad if you like can't recycle because
Yeah,
that's you not having an easy recycling point is like one of the myriad of friction points with effective recycling. So it's not like, oh, if I only did this, it would be fixed. It's like, no, no, no. There's like 50 other problems behind that.
totally. Um, I love that you don't shy away from using the language of small sins, the Garden of Eden, that one of your channels of information is like the theological case that we can make for abundance or healing abundance. Um, you even use the language of our creator. And that is a bold choice. It's a bold, creative choice. It's a choice that I often make creatively. I use a lot of like Holy Virgin Mother iconography in my writing and things of that nature. I use the Garden of Eden mythology a lot in my poetry. I once gave a presentation about the seven deadly sins transformed to the seven virtues as a map of ancestral wisdom. And I am not Christian. I'm assuming you are not religious. I know a little bit about your family background and that the church does exist in your family legacy. But yeah, like why did you make that bold creative choice knowing the association many people have with the language of sin?
Oh, well, you might make me cry on this one, but I do consider myself religious, and I consider myself a religious pluralist, and that pluralism is part of why I felt comfortable using that framing because I do have a great feeling of reverence for the creator, God, the universe, whatever the substrate and origination of this wonderful thing we live in is. That's amazing to me, and that feels meaningful. And I think different traditions have expressed that in different ways, have documented it in different ways, have told that story and narrative in different ways, and have discovered it in different ways. Um, and so part of my work, at the intersection of like ecology, economy, and culture is really about um, I don't think religion and science actually disagree on most of the important stuff. I think most of the important stuff they agree on or mostly align on, and really it's like the details and the nitty-gritty that is largely like unknown and unverified, like it's theoretical stuff in a lot of ways. That's where so much of the contention happens. And so for me, I follow quite a lot of science and scientific research, and I have no internal conflict about also believing that there is a God or a creator. To me, those things are naturally aligned and not divergent concepts. And so part of the creative choice was I wanted to speak to a very wide audience. And that's like generally advised against when you launch a new, piece. Like ideally, you want to go to a niche, but like I really wanted to speak to a wide audience, thinking about my own friends and family and coworkers and people I knew and acquaintances, and how would I speak to them on the topic? Like I feel very comfortable speaking with a religious frame to people who share that frame. I feel very comfortable speaking with a scientific frame to people who share that frame. And so I'm really trying in my writing to integrate those.
Yeah, I just deeply appreciate that. And I'm very curious what sin means to you. How do you understand sin and like what creates sinfulness? Because I'm assuming that you don't have a standard moralistic shaming sort of position on sin. Um, yeah, we'll start there.
Yeah, you're making me realize I probably should have defined sin somewhere. I'll do that later. But yeah, my understanding of sin is it's a mistake or misstep that has unintended consequences. And it may or may not have been intentionally done, but either way, it has unintended consequences. And I think that the unintended consequences to me is where the problem with sin is. Like if it worked out, if the behavior worked out exactly as expected, then I don't think it would be sin. But because it does have unintended consequences, that's what makes it problematic. And even if it is, even if someone is behaving, quote unquote, maliciously, meaning they intend someone harm, I think that's coming from a place of blindness that they don't have the emotional capacity to understand the harm they're committing, likely due to their own traumas. And so my framing of that too is still it's unintended because there's not an intention of causing the emotional harm because that they can't even see that they're blind to. Um, there was a second part of your question. I've lost it.
I'll get to that in a
Okay.
second. So yeah, it's almost I keep thinking about I'm surrounded by Jehovah's Witnesses out here. And I became very curious about their theology because I'm interacting with them more. And they have this thing that other, like, more conservative groups have about like hate the sin, not the sinner. And I wonder if that resonates at all with how you conceptualize and experience sin, or maybe it's more of a like once we know better, do better kind of stance.
Um, I think I would maybe defer to a more like a New Testament, um, a New Testament and Old Testament kind of interpretation of that, which is the I think hate's the wrong word. Like I think that's a language of violence thing. So I would avoid hate. Uh, I would maybe change that to forgive the sin, love the sinner, um,
Mm-hmm.
in my framing. And to me, I think one of the main problems with why we don't look like I'm making this case to like we should look at things, right? Like that's one of the later articles is I'll dive into this in more detail, but like essentially Adam failed on multiple levels and then blamed Eve. Like failed to prevent her from eating the fruit, failed to prevent himself from eating the fruit, and then said, "Well, you handed it to me, it's your fault." Now that's not literally what it said, but that's a common narrative that we have is that sort of blame game piece. And so to me, it's not examining what actually happened from a wider perspective. Like, what was Adam's perspective? What was Eve's perspective? What was the serpent's perspective? What was the fruit's perspective? Like, is the fruit inherently bad, or is it just like being fruit, hanging out? And so to me, the sin is in the not looking and the not understanding and the judgment without understanding more than the actual behavior. In other words, um, the fact that it's an unintended consequence, the moral responsibility lies in the not looking. So this is where we in the US have a real problem with, and I talk about this in the article, the first one, um, like I'm using an Apple computer. I texted you this morning on an Apple iPhone. That was almost definitely made with slave labor of and likely child labor. Um, I don't think about that every day. And I don't think most of us want to think about that every day. And I do think it's important to like look though. Like, hey, I actually decided recently, like after doing some of this research, like I'm not buying Apple products anymore. Um, because I looked at where they came from. And that to me is where the healing is like we're like we hate the sin, we hate the sinner sometimes, and that keeps us from looking and keeps us from forgiving and keeps us from understanding. And that's what I'm trying to kind of approach this research with is like curiosity and forgiveness of myself and others. Like I'm not saying this company is bad or I'm bad or you're bad if you do something. I'm trying to really avoid good and bad framing, good and evil framing, because the sort of the fall or the original sin was eating fruit from the tree of not knowledge of good and evil, right? And so I'm trying to avoid that sort of knowledge and good of good and evil and that binary framing and just try to understand, try to like see as much as I can of the picture and piece together the puzzle, like what pieces I can find.
Yeah. And, I feel like as a person who has a lot of willingness and a huge capacity to look, I get to the point where I'm so overwhelmed. Like living in this culture, in this society, it's like you can't not be complicit in like extremely harmful, extremely harmful and extractive, exploitative systems atop of systems intersecting with, you can't not exist in that. And it's like there's there's only so much, even as a person with a huge capacity for it, for looking, there's only so much I can rightfully take in at one time. There's only so much I can take in before I become paralyzed. And there are so many things, right? Like I am putting this podcast on Spotify, which is now funding genocide. It's like there's so, like, what if I'm on a road trip and I need to stop at a Chick-fil-A because there's nothing else halfway decent to eat with my kids? It's like, what do we do? Like the because we can't do it all, right? We can't be perfect consumers or perfect citizens because the harm is everywhere. And because like we can't not be complicit in the harm because it's everywhere. So I almost feel like it's a matter of just like discerning for ourselves. It's almost like what breaks my heart the most in this particular season of my life and or in my life and like dedicating myself to that because I simply cannot hold it all and do it all. And and speaking of capacity limits, you also write that the world is not running out of capacity. The world is being prevented from expressing the capacity it still has. And you also say the problem is never supply, the problem is distribution, which is to say it is a problem of who decides what gets sent where and why. And so leading into that, you're talking a lot about how the arithmetic isn't theoretical. We already produce about 2,900 calories per person per day against a need of roughly 2,100. The waste a third of it. Over 1 billion meals a day land in the trash, while 783 million people go hungry. 1 in 10 homes in the developed world sit empty. 42 million vacant units across the OECD, while 318 million people sleep without shelter. That's the one that breaks my heart. That's the one I can't let go of. Of course, as a sacred homemaker, I'm like, just give everybody a home. Nobody should be homeless. That should not be a thing. Everybody should be housed. Um, but yeah, circling back to the problem is never supply, the problem is distribution, which is to say it is a problem of who decides what gets sent where and why. the lack of channels of distribution, which is an essential component of abundance, of like living in abundance, or like rather like distributing the abundance that is already available to us, that has always been available to us, um, more or less. Um, this lack of channels of distribution is something I see everywhere in microcosms and macrocosms in our society. And, post Helene, this was very, very apparent because what happened was, once people realized we had been destroyed by the hurricane, they started sending supplies. So many supplies. So many supplies. The relief centers, oh, and clothes were the epitome of this. Mountains and mountains of clothes, a second flood of clothes filling my small town. And the relief centers were completely overwhelmed because of this lack of channels of distribution. So they couldn't get the supplies to the people who needed them. And because, again, this is all happening in a consumer culture, and I see this in people's homes as well, as we have way too many clothes. The mass production of the clothing industry is like its own monstrosity of an overproduction problem. So we like had enough clothes and like didn't have always enough of the other things we needed, but then there was more than we needed, but also we just couldn't distribute them to the people in need. Like people couldn't get to us, we couldn't get to them. They had to start turning away supplies, and that was offensive to people. Sidebar, people were also donating clothing full of holes and stains, that had to go straight in the trash. So the relief workers were spending a lot of time throwing things in the trash. Anyway, what would channels of distribution look like, at each level of human community? How do we do this? How do we solve this channels of distribution problem? I know you might not have the answer, but I'm keen to know. Yeah, what have you read about this? Who else might be solving this channels of distribution problem?
Yeah, there's an author, Charles Eisenstein, who's researched and written quite a lot about different economies. And
He's
um,
Asheville based, I'm pretty sure, isn't
oh,
he?
really? I didn't know that.
I think he might be. Yeah, he's pretty popular in these parts.
So yeah, I mean, so then yeah, he's done a lot of research about like gift economies,
Right.
and um, I think that's something that gift economies naturally emerge in times of crisis in a lot of communities. So people wanting to just like, here, I've got this extra thing, or I can easily get this thing for you, like I'll share it with you because you need it, right? Not because you paid me the right amount, but just because you need it, I have it, here you go. And so I think we can work something closer to that. And I want to kind of just circle back to where you started the thread about, um, you're on the road trip and you need to eat, and like the only place is the place you maybe don't agree with their values, or you need a computer, or you need, there's all these things you need. I think I think the value is in just figuring out where you have influence over and control over. And even if that's small, just like understanding and managing that. So not trying to solve Apple's supply chain problem that's like very far out of your reach. Not trying to, you know, not eat on a road trip because you just don't like this organization or something like that, or you don't agree with their values. Um, and the approach that I found most helpful in framing this is harm reduction, which is in the substance abuse research and healing. And because I view our society's use of plastic and oil as a cultural addiction. And I'll dig into this later in the series as well, but the if you think about the society as sort of a macroorganism, the addiction paradigm fits really, really well. And the harm reduction treatment approach is not about ripping the band-aid off, cutting the supply. It's more about like a weaning and gentle direction and like, hey, give you the support you need to step away and to let go of this unhealthy thing. And so to me, that's where the most valuable work is not like I should beat myself up because I ate at a Chick-fil-A or a McDonald's or what, whatever you don't align with on your values. But to me, the value and the healing is in what would support me to make a decision that does align with my values and kind of focusing in that direction. And to me, that also addresses on a microcosm scale the distribution problem, which is that's like the distribution of resources to yourself or to your family. And I think as a society, that's also a set of decisions that we're going to have to make, which is what do we value and are we distributing things in accordance with our values? And what do we collectively value and are we distribute how are we collectively distributing things? And so to me, it's not a here's the answer, it's communism, or here's the answer, it's socialism, or here's the answer, it's capitalism. To me, it's a harm reduction approach of like, hey, what are we missing? Let's see if we can address the stuff we're missing and like what will we need to address that. And I think that will naturally let the unhealthier cultural behaviors fall away because a lot of, and I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of like a lot of accumulation of things and kind of the hoarding behaviors, and this is certainly my experience as well, was about trying to fill a lack. Like I couldn't afford the thing that I wanted, so I bought a cheap version and it broke, and then I felt guilty throwing it away. Like that happened a lot for me. So like that was me sort of holding myself back by holding myself like in guilt around this mistake or small sin I made. Um, versus saying, "Hey, let me let go of this thing." And actually, there's something there's a hole I'm trying to fill with this thing that didn't work. Let me take a step back and really try to understand what's missing and look for that and try to approach that. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from with the series as well.
Yeah, there's all of these negative feedback loops that I'm envisioning as you're talking about this because there's a very real infrastructure issue when like lack of infrastructure issue when it comes to channels of distribution too. Like part of the problem to return to that relief center example post Helene was that there was no storage, there was no building to put things in. And that's a problem that could have been solved if we lived in a more like generous and kind of like abundance oriented culture where like a person who owns a building could have just given it to the relief centers. And of course, we were depending on public infrastructure because that's all there was. Churches, fire stations, and schools became relief centers. And while I love like that we stacked the function of those public buildings in a crisis and it worked really well in some regards, it was still inadequate. And there were still, I'm sure, plenty of privately owned properties that could have been utilized in that crisis that were not because of this, lack of access to generosity and like it's not even an abundance mindset, but like capacity to like tolerate abundance. And there are all sorts of interesting intricacies going on there in terms of like why the people who hoard the most resources are the least likely to have access to their generosity. And why the people who have the most material wealth are living in the most like sense of scarcity, like the deepest sense of scarcity. And like how, yeah, consumer culture is like reside living in the belly of the beast of consumer culture creates that that is the environmental context, cultural environmental context. But yeah, there are several other things I want to touch on, so let's talk
Actually,
for
can I add one more thing before you do, which is
sure.
that one of the other things you mentioned is like the overwhelm, with like there is some like talking about like looking and examining. There's so much overwhelm, and a lot of those things are triggering or traumatic, in my experience. And um, I want to just be clear that I also think it's okay not to look. Like I don't think you have to look at everything. Like I think it's more important about looking at yourself and looking at the things that you can touch, the things within your reach, and not kind of again not letting yourself get overwhelmed by like, oh, this thing bad thing is happening and this bad thing is happening. Like unless you were the one that made the decision for that bad thing, like let that stuff go and think about yourself and your own behavior and your, like, am I being generous with my time with my kids? Like that's within your control. That's, sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's within your control. When it is, like that's something to sort of that you have control over that, and that's really impactful. And I think that that human connection piece is probably the most impactful thing we can do more than recycling or changing supply changes, like the generosity and the willingness to sit with each other in difficult circumstances. That to me is where the real healing work is.
Agreed. Yeah, that's very much the premise of Hearthcraft, and it's why sacred domesticity is like my has become my spiritual orientation, because at the very least I can always return to what is happening within my own heart and home and make sure that I'm more or less consistently returning to, within the bounds of my own integrity, living in accordance to my own deepest values. Um, Yeah, so distribution, returning to distribution for a moment here. You also write, we have built a civilization whose central aspirational object cannot be universally distributed, even in principle, on a planet already produces enough to feed, clothe, house, and heal every person on it. Um, I'm curious, like, how do you define our central aspirational object? What does that mean?
Well, okay, that was a typo. It should have been objects. But the things I was referring to are like the iPhone, the electric car, like the idea that if everybody had an iPhone, everybody had an electric, if everybody just drove electric instead of diesel or gas or whatever, then we wouldn't have an environmental problem. And not recognizing that the environmental challenges we have are exacerbated by the electric cars and the iPhones. Like they're not helping, they're making the problem worse. Um, and that's not and I don't mean like, again, this is not like an individual, like a person buying an electric car is not the problems I'm talking about. Like I'm talking about the cultural way that we've approached electric cars, that sort of thing, like the way they're manufactured, all of that. Um, but the I spent a lot of time researching those supply chains and the manufacturing processes and uh, scientific innovation, like relevant scientific innovation, and like what if we, improve by 90% the efficiency of batteries? And what if we improve by 90% the efficiency of electric distribution? And so I kind of played it out in a very optimistic scenario, or modeled out in a very optimistic scenario that sort of everything goes well. Um, then can everybody have an electric car? And the
Right.
answer is no. The answer is no. And so and that, that's like rounding up in every possible way kind of thing. And it's still the math is just like completely, totally
Right. So the math is
unworkable.
like everybody cannot have an electric car, everybody cannot have an iPhone, presumably, but like everybody can have food and shelter and medicine and yeah, these like baseline needs met. Certainly clothing. We never need to produce another piece of clothing as far as I can see, although a lot of it is shit. Yes. Um, yeah, so it's the way that I perceive like I actually call it death phobic consumer culture, what death phobic consumer culture does to the way like how it distorts the way that we experience our own desire and like fulfillment of desire and our own needs and unmet needs is that it takes a legitimate desire or legitimate need, it then creates an abstraction of that desire or need, and then or like a symbol of that desire or need. So an example of this would be like the apple of Eden versus the Apple products, the Apple iPhone. It then sells us back a symbol of that need or desire in the form of consumer goods, often consumer goods that, are produced in an unsustainable way and this is key, that do not fulfill the desire and do not meet the true need, right? So consumer culture depends on our insatiability. It depends on our chronic discontentment and dissatisfaction. The other example that I often use is like the mall Santa. So we are hungry for seasonal and spiritual shared traditions. And what our culture offers us is a creepy mall Santa that makes children cry and costs, I don't even know how much because I don't participate in that ritual, a lot of money to access and is also a miserable experience. Like you're standing in line in a mall to traumatize your child with a creepy mall. So of course we're still hungry. Of course we're still, you know, discontent. So yeah, it's always like the nature of this monster, this death phobic consumer culture monster is like it's taking something real and then it's selling us back something fake that resembles the real thing. And the lawn, you kind of like you don't go into, you kind of go after the American lawn in this piece is another great example of that. So there's this distinction between the lawn versus the victory garden, and even like the victory garden versus the Garden of Eden. Um, and Yeah, you say the lawn is not neutral. The lawn is a position, and it is not the position our creator took.
I sure
Yeah,
did.
that there's no question here. I'm just like, here, tell me more.
Um, well, I think and I also put two pictures side by side in the article that I took of like the same geography, the same geology, hydrology, like uh, basically everything's the same except how humans have treated that land, and that's the difference between the two pictures. And one of them is a beautiful lawn, and one of them is a beautiful wild space, and the beautiful wild space is full of food and medicine, and the beautiful lawn is almost entirely absent of it. Um, the decision that we make, or the position we've taken is that, and this is like a legal position and a cultural position and like a recreational position. Like we're taking this in multiple areas of our life, and in multiple ways, is that if you have a home, you should have a lawn and you should care for it in a certain way. And I'm not here to tell, like I'm not saying like again, no judgment on my side. Like if you get value out of having a lawn, absolutely have a lawn. Like I'm not trying to tell somebody not to do that. But what I am saying, or what the piece that I'm inserting there is that we as a culture, like as food gets more expensive, are spending money and time and effort on something that produces no food on land that could produce food, and just making that kind of comparison. And I think, and to be a little cheeky, like I don't remember any mention in Genesis of, God creating a lawn. Like that to me is a human creation, not a divine creation. And that's kind of where that particular quote that you mentioned, like that's what I was trying to drive home is that um, the gift of the creator was a garden, not a lawn. And we'd invented the lawn, and I could speak for hours about how and why I researched, like why, where the lawn came from and all this stuff. But generally, it was kings and royalty in Europe proving their power over nature and, by effect, in some ways, God. And so they were like, we can control nature. Look how much control we can exert, and every blade of grass will be perfectly level and blah, blah. Like that was them showing off their power. And we're all trying to like emulate that. And we've encoded that into our legal system to require that. And so, but that was a decision we make, and that's a position we take as a society. And I'm trying to kind of juxtapose those two pieces of like, here's this gift that was a garden with no mention of lawns, and here's this creation that we spend it if it produced something, it would be the largest crop in the country. And we use the most water for it compared to any other crop, and we use the most fertilizers for it compared to any other crop. And we're using a lot of gas for, like and other, and electricity. So it's like the amount of resources we're pouring into this thing that's literally producing scarcity, like we're poisoning it so that it produces less. Um, that to me is what I was trying to kind of just show those two images side by side and draw that picture with words.
So speaking of abundance, I feel like there's just an abundance of topics we could go into here. But before we conclude our conversation, can you give us a little bit of a teaser in terms of where you're going with this series and what you get into around this? I feel like it's one of the organizing questions, at least that comes up for me when I'm reading this piece, which is, what would it take to create more robust alternative systems of abundance? Knowing the proverbial powers that be are not getting with the program, and that the dominant culture does not have the capacity for this kind of generosity, let alone the imagination required to accept the reality of abundance. And I think that's funny that it requires imagination to accept the reality. Yeah, so knowing all of this, you know, like or rather, how do you start to answer these questions? Can we answer these questions? Yeah, what's the teaser in terms of where you're taking us through this
Yeah.
series?
So a lot of it is about being gentle with yourself, like really taking that non-judgmental framing and applying it to others, but also to yourself. And I don't have all the answers. Like I'm looking very hard, but like I don't have them. That's why I'm looking. Um, the that gentleness though allows you to be curious. Like that's what allows you to look is like accepting that you may have made mistakes in the past or you may have had there may be unintended consequences of your actions that don't align with your values. And instead of hating yourself or beating yourself up about that, loving yourself, forgiving yourself, and being curious about it, wondering why did that happen? Why did I make that mistake? Not oh, I'm such an idiot. I shouldn't have, like, or I'm so careless, or whatever, with all the ways that we sort of beat ourselves up about different things. Um, and then I think once you're coming from that frame of curiosity, extending that curiosity to what do I have control or influence over? And no matter how small, channeling that same energy that makes us want to um, accumulate trash because we feel like we're diverting it from a landfill, channeling that energy into like, what's the smallest possible thing I could do towards cultivating and supporting my own abundance, and building on those little small things instead of trying to like eat the elephant, like really taking it from a gentle self approach and what can I control? And thinking about like, hey, if there's not a lot of stuff can control, that makes my decision easy, right? Then I don't have to decide between 50 things. I only have two things. And that one option might take me 5 minutes once a week. And but then you can actually appreciate that as like, hey, I'm doing the part that I can playing the part that I can play. And to me, that's also where the distribution piece comes into play, which is like in each of our roles with different resources, we have access to different things. We have perspectives on different things. And using that collectively, I think, is where there's quite a lot of power and ability for collective change.
So when in doubt, return to small healings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for talking with me. I always love our conversations. You have such a
Thank you.
beautiful brain. Thank you for all of your efforts doing this amazing piece of research and so artfully weaving together the mathematical, theological, ecological, and neurobiological case for abundance. Yeah, I hope we can talk some more. another time, another supper table, and yeah, wishing you well.
Thank you so much.